So I'm Kelly Clark, and I'm going to have a conversation with Nick Wolterstorff, and I mean by conversation, I'm going to read a few things from his books, and then he's going to drop a few pearls of wisdom on us. And I thought I'd start where he starts in his book. Bigelow, my birthplace, tiny village on the prairies of southwest Minnesota, population around 200. The streets had no names, the houses no numbers. Everybody knew where everybody lived, no need for names and numbers. And so right here I just started thinking, and I'm just spitballing here, Nick, I might be wrong, but are you the best philosopher from Bigelow, Minnesota? Am I right?
I'll stick my neck out and say yes.
Okay, all right. I'm honored. All right. So this whole, well, let me read a couple of other quotes here. Henrietta and I were born, and Henrietta is here. She asked me not to say her name or point her out. She's not in the front row sitting next to Nick's daughter. Henrietta and I were born on January 21, 1932, delivered on the dining room table, so we were told. I was named after our paternal grandfather, my sister after our maternal grandmother. Our mother, Agnes, died when we were 3.5 years old, 10 days after giving birth, 6 weeks prematurely to another set of twins, Cornelius John and Cornelia Joanne, this time in the clinic in Worthington. I have only one memory of her alive, sitting in a rocking chair, holding me on her lap after I had stumbled on a boardwalk outside and gotten dozens of slivers in my forearm. So here's my first question, Nick. How did you get here from there? How did you get to Harvard and Cambridge and Yale? You gave the prestigious Gifford lectures, and now you're being interviewed by me tonight. How did you get here from there? And as long as we're talking about there, who are some of the people in the photos that we saw, and how did they help you get here?
How did we get here from there? Well, slowly, 87 years. So I don't fully know how to answer that question, Kelly. Let me just mention two things. One, when I was growing up, I was taught, not by telling, but by just modeling, the importance of hard work, stick-to-itiveness, not complaining, accepting what's given you. That sort of fits with a point that Steve was making about what befell me. Secondly, by the grace of God, I was given opportunities that fitted my talents. I said I was going to make 2 points. I'll make 3 or 4. Third, the training that my community gave me, the family, but the community as a whole. You have to visualize, some of you have told me that when you read the book, it reminded you of small villages in the Midwest and so forth, in which you too have grown up. They were genuine communities of shared concern. It was not just parents and children, but the adults minded, tended each other's children. So as I say in the book, we as children soon learned who was nice and who was bossy. And we tried to avoid the bossy people, of course. But I think the other thing to add, Kelly, is that I was fortunate to grow up at a time in this country which was, for white males like me, a time of extraordinary privilege. I say for white males like me. It was not for women. It was not for colored people, for white males like me. And until my 20s, I suppose, I simply accepted that as fact of life. I then soon began to see the injustice of it. We'll get to some of the injustices later on. But I was privileged to live in a time after the Second World War when American colleges and universities were expanding, when jobs for academic people like me were opening up. When I got a PhD from Harvard, I didn't know of any colleague who was also getting a PhD who did not also almost immediately get a job. In my last 10, 15 years of teaching at Yale, I had to console students who got no job for 4 years and then got one-year jobs for 6 years. And I have no idea how psychologically they managed it. I'm not sure that I could have managed it. So I lived through a golden age. I, as a white male, lived through a golden age in the history in general of America, the political history, and the educational history. So that's one way of answering how from that tiny little village to here.
All right. So we're really making a lot of progress here. We're already through childhood. This is something he wrote about college. Nick went to Calvin College, and he said this about it. College proved to be for me a journey into self-understanding. Here in this college of the religious tradition in which I had been reared, Reformed Protestantism, I began to understand the tradition and thus myself by watching it at work in some remarkably gifted and dedicated teachers. I learned how to live with integrity within the tradition, within any tradition, how to discern and embrace its fundamental contours while treating its details as matters of indifference, how to appropriate what in the tradition is capable of nourishing life in one's own day while leaving the rest behind, how to criticize the tradition from within, expand its scope, celebrate its accomplishments, empathize with its anxieties and its memories of suffering. I think of a passage from the night section of part 1 of Goethe's Faust. What you have as heritage, take now as task, for thus you will make it your own. So, and he writes about this a lot in here, and I'd like you to discuss this. So what did you acquire as heritage? And maybe you can talk about your favorite teachers that you talk about in here, Henry Staub and Harry Jellema. And then what did you take as task from this tradition? Yeah. And then how have you made the tradition your own?
So before I answer the question, I do want to get to that question. For me, entering Calvin College was indeed gaining insight into the deep levels of the tradition in which I had been reared. But it was not only that, it was also, I remember, exhilaration. And I'm not sure how many high school kids going to college nowadays find it exhilarating. It was exhilarating. It was the sense of entering a bright and shiny new world. I'd had good teachers in high school, but it was enrapturing and intimidating. In the book, I tell the story about my freshman English class taught by another master teacher, Henry Zylstra. And I remember vividly that on the first day of class, Zylstra used 3 words that I had never heard in Southwest Minnesota. To this day, I remember one of them, chivalrous. Nobody in Southwest Minnesota had ever, to the best of my knowledge, used the word chivalrous. So I copied these words down and ran home and bought a dictionary from the bookstore and wrote out the definitions. And then the next day, next class, he used 3 more words that I'd never heard. So it was this sense of exhilaration. And as I say, when I look at my own grandchildren, well, they haven't entering college. When I listen to contemporary students talk, I'm not sure how many of them, upon entering college, university, have a sense of exhilaration. And that's a great loss. College should be not just pouring facts and so forth into you, training you and so forth for a job in the economy, but it should be exhilarating. You should say, my gosh, I've never seen it that way before. How wonderful, how wonderful. Okay, so the tradition in which I'd been reared was Dutch Reformed Protestantism on the prairies of immigrant Dutch on the prairies of Southwest Minnesota. Now the story about the Reformed tradition, the Reformed Calvinist tradition, the standard story about it is that it's all about election. I've learned recently that idea comes out of the 19th century, actually, when German philosophers in the Hegelian tradition wanted to find the essence of one thing and another. And the essence of Calvinism then was election. The essence of Lutheranism was grace, and so forth. I don't recall ever hearing sermons about election. That was not. When I think back to the tradition as I experienced it, it was devout. It was biblically oriented in church and family. But it was also living joyfully, enjoying the world. In the book, I tell the story of my father, a simple little story. He was in essence, his very nature was that he was a woodworker. That's just who he was. And I can still see, he'd collect different species of hardwoods. He didn't like softwood like pine and fir and so forth, hardwood. He'd collect different species, rough boards, unplaned. He'd rub his hands over them and say, Nick, this is going to make something really beautiful and lovely. So I was taught reverence for wood, reverence for the earth. I remember my uncle for whom I worked, Uncle Chuck, just glorying in improving the soil on his farm and how well the crops were doing this year. It was taking delight in our earthly existence, but also acting lovingly and responsibly to each other. The community, the extended family in which I grew up was they were argumentative. I talk about the arguments in the book, but in the midst of all the arguments, they were loving. They'd help each other out. I shall not forget Uncle Chuck and Aunt Clara getting into a vigorous dispute in one of these arguments, and at the end of it, standing up when it was time to go, kissing each other, hugging each other, and off they'd go. So Kelly, it was thinking back, I experienced, this maybe sounds crazy to some people, but there in our living room, we moved when we were 12 years old, Henrietta and I, to Edgerton, a much bigger village of 1,000 people instead of 200. In our living room there, the most wonderful intellectual conversations, discussions in which everybody participated, women as well as men, young kids as soon as they wanted to participate. So what stood me in, you asked how I got from there to here. One thing that happened was I learned in those family discussions about everything under the sun. You have to go back 70 years, Harold Stassen, Hubert Humphrey, the dams that were being built on the Missouri, what they would do to the local Native Americans, the pesticides that were, all of this. I learned to separate the person from the argument. You could disagree with somebody, even disagree vigorously, politely, but you were not attacking the person. And as you know as well as I, and Steve knows, essential to philosophy, and indeed to the academic enterprise in general, is that you have to distinguish the person from the argument. The fact that you're disagreeing should not be understood as an attack. Well, sometimes it is an attack, but it should not be an attack. So the tradition as I absorbed it, acted lovingly towards each other, took joy in material things, took joy in conversation. So it was, I suppose, in a word, it was life-affirming. That's how I experienced the tradition, life-affirming.
So you left Calvin and you went to graduate school, PhD program at Harvard, and this will be more familiar to philosophers, but I think you'll get the point. Those were the glory days of the Harvard Philosophy Department. Willard Van Orman Quine, Carl Hempel, C.I. Lewis, Nelson Goodman, and D.C. Williams were all in the faculty, to name just 5 of the most prominent figures. There's a lot of buzz about so-called logical positivism, a movement I had not heard about at Calvin. One of the claims of the positivists was that sentences that purport to be about God are in fact meaningless, not false, but meaningless. It wasn't long before I discerned that this claim was not a drinking in of objective facts about meaning, but it was instead an implication of the positivist worldview. I don't want to ask you to explain positivism, Nick, but you went from a Christian undergraduate institution where everybody held roughly your views and shared roughly the same worldview to a PhD program at Harvard, which was anti-theistic. That's the point I wanted to make from there. anti-religious, and probably even more so anti-Christian. They probably especially didn't like Christianity.
Yeah.
So two questions occur to me. How as a young man were you able to resist these anti-religious sentiments and the influence of your brilliant and prestigious philosophers? And second, how did you take what you learned at Harvard as heritage and task?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, Kelly, I've got to go back to a question you asked about my college education, my teachers, philosophy as I experienced it, and so forth. So let me say a word about that. As I say in the book, I didn't choose philosophy. Philosophy chose me. I shall never forget, in those days, I think still today, there is a required philosophy course. I took it in the first semester of my sophomore year, taught by a terrific teacher, Henry Staub. We are halfway into the first session, and I think, this is it. I have no idea whether I'll be any good at this stuff, but if I am, this is it. So people have asked me, you may have asked me, well, what did Staub say in that first half hour? I have no memory of what he said in that first half hour. I just know that it was magical. So how is philosophy taught? Well, for one thing, and this was a contrast to Harvard, we'll get to that. At Calvin, as we put it, we studied philosophy. When I got to Harvard, everybody talked about doing philosophy. We studied philosophy, the philosophers of the past. Now, one way of studying philosophy, which some of you may have experienced, is that the teacher introduces you to the so-called problems of philosophy, the problems of theory of knowledge, the problems of theory of art, and so forth. That is not how my teachers at Calvin taught philosophy, Jalom and Staub. They taught it as a succession of worldviews. Deep and profound attitudes about God, reality, what's worthwhile, the world are coming to expression in philosophy. And you don't just want to plow through a bunch of problems, but you want to find out what view of reality, what worldview, world and life view was shaping the ancient Greek philosophers. You want to get to the problems after that, because, I mean, they expressed their worldview in the form of convictions and so forth. So I've always thought that what is more or less the standard way of doing, ever since my college days, I thought that the sort of standard way of doing philosophy, problems, misses out on what's really important about philosophy. In philosophy, I venture to say, as in no other academic discipline, the worldviews of human beings are being worked out in various areas of life. And that's what I learned from my Calvin professors. And the second thing I learned from them, Kelly, is that there was no index of forbidden books. We could read anything. There was never a suggestion that, oh, you're a Christian, so you should stay away from Nietzsche, for example. If you want to read Nietzsche. And a third very important thing, we Protestants, some of us Protestants, often think of the church as really beginning with Charles and John Wesley in the 1800s. And everything before that is, well, I don't know. That's Catholic stuff, you know. My teachers, Harry Jalom and Henry Staub, said, no. The medieval philosophers are your Christian heritage. You stand in that line. Don't forget it. So the whole sweep of philosophy was for us to discuss and talk about and so forth. So now I get to Harvard. So I've got this view imbued in me that philosophy is, at bottom, the working out of worldviews, fundamental worldviews. And I find, well, two things at Harvard. They have little interest in the history of philosophy. I'd been trained in the history of philosophy, but the Harvard philosophers of the time had little interest in the history of philosophy. It was all about doing philosophy. And to do philosophy, you've got to be current with what's going on. So I had even though I'd been very well trained in the history of philosophy at Calvin, I had a steep learning curve to find out what was going on in 1950 in the 50s, the 40s and the 50s. And what was going on, especially in those days, as you say, was positivism. The idea that statements about God, reality in general, have no meaning. You can't verify them by standard scientific techniques. So they have no meaning. And this was a really hot topic in those days. I mean, it really was. It sounds musty to most people nowadays, really musty. But I didn't find my faith threatened because I said to myself, well, I'm very doubtful that these positivists are just sort of drinking in the objective meaning of meaning. There's a worldview at work here, and the worldview was pretty clear. It was the positivists' conviction that natural science was the road forward. All other modes of inquiry were just dead ends. So if you think that, then you got to tell me how natural science and its way of talking and thinking and so forth differs from all the other stuff, the bad stuff. So it was that worldview that was shaping what they were doing, that natural science is the road forward. I didn't believe it for a minute. And I mean, really, that natural science is the road forward for humanity? I found this totally implausible. And I saw that it was that worldview that was shaping the enterprise. So I viewed it with, I don't know, a sort of bemused detachment. And I had a professor, D.C. Williams, my mentor actually, whose attitude was the same. D.C. was a classical metaphysician. His attitude about positivism was, oh, this too shall pass, as it did in 5 years or so. Now the Christian part of it, Kelly, so my professors at Harvard, my fellow students, knew that I was a Christian. None of them ever berated me or belittled me on that account. And I don't know what was going on. I think I sometimes speculate that probably what was going on in their minds was this Wolterstorff fellow, he comes from the Midwest, he's religious, but he seems quite bright, he'll probably get over it. So, I mean, they never quite said that, but that fits what they did say. So I never, well, that's the answer to your question. I never felt my faith challenged. It was rather I and others have to figure out a way of showing the silliness of the positivist enterprise, which then, within 5 years, succeeded and positivism collapsed. I'm giving answers that are too long for your short questions.
So in the fall of 1963...
Is the sound still okay?
You were teaching at Calvin,
Yeah.
then you said, Alvin Plantinga joined our department. Al had left Yale when I did and taught for a few years at Wayne State University in Detroit. He was as committed as I was to the project of Christian philosophy and to practicing philosophy, not just studying philosophy. So this goes by quickly, but here's two young philosophers fresh out of graduate school, Plantinga and Wolterstorff, and that would become like a term of art, Plantinga and Wolterstorff. They were on the verge of becoming two of the greatest Christian philosophers of the 20th century. So what was your relationship like with Alvin, and how did that shape you and him going forward?
Yeah, well, I don't want to say much about how it shaped him, but so...
He's not here, he could have been.
Yeah, he could have been, yeah. Well,
he had his chance.
But he had a good reason for not being here, attending a memorial service for a friend of his. So Al spent his first year, I think just 1 year at Harvard, and then Al's father was teaching psychology at Calvin at the time. So when Al came back home for a spring vacation, he listened to some of Harry Jellema's lectures, and he found Jellema's lectures far more enrapturing than anything that he'd been hearing at Harvard. So he transferred, left Harvard for Calvin, and so we met in my junior year and became instant friends and philosophical colleagues, and have remained that ever since. Eventually, I think, Kelly, what happened was that without making any big decisions on the matter, we sort of parceled out some of the territory without making, as I say, without actually making a decision. Al would concentrate on philosophy of religion, and especially would answer in all kinds of ways, would deal in all kinds of ways with the widespread charge that religious people are somehow irrational. A colleague of mine at Yale put it like this: religious people suffer from a rationality deficit. Al would deal with that, and Al has dealt with that in varied ways over the years with great intellectual imagination, acuity, and so forth. And I would proceed on
Everything else?
on the assumption that, I'm not going to argue that case. I'm just going to take it that it's perfectly reputable for me to be a Christian and to be a Christian philosopher. And then I would deal with things to say in more specific areas of philosophy, like theory of knowledge and philosophy of art and justice and so forth. So over the years, we've had this sort of informal compact. Let me say one more thing. I taught for 2 years at Yale, in 57 to 59. Parenthesis, let me explain how that happened, because this is an example of the injustice that I hinted at. I had gotten my degree from Harvard. Harvard gave me, in the spring of my third year at Harvard, my mentor, D.C. Williams, hands me a pamphlet on the Sheldon Traveling Fellowships at Harvard. And D.C. says to me, you should apply for this. Wolterstorff, he always addressed me as Wolterstorff. So I looked at it and I said, but Professor Williams, this is designed for people who have to do research abroad, and everything that I need is available in Harvard Library and in Cambridge bookstores. And furthermore, I expect to have my dissertation finished this summer. He said, I know all that, it doesn't make any difference. So I applied and got this fellowship. 6 of us. Classicist J.P. Elder is the chair of the Sheldon Traveling Fellowship. Well, he has the 6 of us over for a sherry party. And he knows what's up, and he taps me on the shoulder. And these are his exact words. Wolterstorff, you should use this money to sample European culture. And I instantly had the thought, well, who am I, a kid from the farm country of Minnesota, to tell Harvard how they should and shouldn't spend their money? So we did that. So Claire and I we spent a term in Cambridge, England, then the spring in Amsterdam. And here's where we get to the injustice of it. Sitting in Amsterdam, and I get a letter from the head of the Yale philosophy department offering me a position in the Yale philosophy department. He didn't ask me to apply or anything like that. He just offered the job. Now, he was very courtly, Brand Blanchard. So I never dared ask him how this went, but I know how it went. He called up the chair of the Harvard philosophy department and said, do you have any recent graduates? The chair of Harvard department said, try Wolterstorff. So everybody outside this old boys network was excluded, right? That's the injustice of it. It was deeply unfair to everybody but me. Now, what was your question?
Question. Well, I think we're almost ready for unfair. So let's move to the next topic.
Okay.
You write this a little bit later on. In September 1975, I attended a conference at the University of
Potchefstroom.
there you go, in South Africa that changed my life. And then he writes this: apartheid was still in full force. I knew about apartheid. One could not be a member of a denomination belonging to the Reformed family of churches without knowing about apartheid. What I knew about it I found reprehensible, an embarrassment to my tradition, Now I saw it in operation. Blancs Aline, whites only, were allowed to live in this area or ride that bus, to stop in this store or patronize that restaurant, to use these toilets. The racial segregation that the civil rights movement was dismantling in the United States was thriving in South Africa. And then one more quotation from this section. The concern for justice that the conference in Potchefstroom awakened in me soon expanded and deepened. In May 1978, I attended a conference in Chicago on Palestinian rights. I never learned why I was invited, nor have I understood why I felt impelled to attend. Along with most other Americans, I had celebrated Israel's victory in the 1967 war, tiny Israel triumphant over Arab neighbors trying to crush it. I knew no more about the plight of Palestinians than was reported in the mainstream American press, which was very little. And many of you probably know, but Nick became involved in the fight against apartheid in South Africa, and also working together with Palestinians for peace in Israel, Palestine. So, and that section alone would be worth reading the book for. So I put how, and I mean how in the way whatever it was worked on you.
Yeah.
How and in what way did your exposure to apartheid in South Africa and Israel, Palestine change your life and your life work?
Yeah, and some of you have heard me tell these stories before, but not all. So indeed, in 1975, when I was on the staff of Calvin College, I was sent by the college to an international conference at the University of Potchefstroom, very much an Afrikaner university. Potchefstroom is a medium-sized city, about an hour and a half drive outside of Johannesburg. The conference was on higher education in the Protestant tradition. There were Afrikaners there. There were so-called colored people and blacks from South Africa, scholars. Sizable contingent of Dutchmen, a few people from other parts of Africa, and a few of us North Americans and some Asians. Apartheid was not the topic of the conference, but everybody was conscious of it, and in the coffee breaks and the meals and so forth, it was far and away the dominant topic. Furthermore, the Dutch were extremely well informed about apartheid, and they were very clever about inserting it into the conference itself. They would, something like this, a professor from South Africa would give a lecture on Protestant higher education in the southern part of well, whatever. And then a Dutchman would get up, let's say the Afrikaner was named Van der Merwe. A Dutchman would get up and say, I found your talk very interesting and informative, Professor Van der Merwe. But what you said towards the end there made me think about the system of apartheid, so I'd like to ask you a question about that. So they just slyly insert the topic into everything. So after a while, after a few days of this, the Afrikaners saw their conference being hijacked, and they consented to hold an evening session which was devoted just to the topic of apartheid. It remains the most intense discussion I have ever experienced. The Dutch were very well informed about apartheid, as I've said, and very angry about it. And Afrikaans is a variant of Dutch. So the Dutch vented their anger. Later I learned that usually when someone criticized the system of apartheid, Afrikaners said, but you don't understand. They couldn't say to the Dutch, but you don't understand, because the Dutch understood very well. So the Afrikaners defending apartheid said, why are you so judgmental? You're just so terribly judgmental, so arrogant, so ethically arrogant. Why are you like that? After 45 minutes of this angry back and forth, neither party had anything new to say to the other. And then the people of color from South Africa spoke up. Described from their point of view the system of apartheid, and described from their point of view the petty humiliations that they experienced. More in tones, as I heard it at the time, of hurt than of anger. but they have to say. And they issued a call for justice. I had opposed the Vietnam War. I had participated a bit in the civil rights struggle, and looking back at my notes, I used the notion of justice, but it hadn't been dominant. I can only say that when these people of color spoke up there in that conference room, I had the sense that through their voice, God was calling me to speak up for these suffering people and to speak up for justice. The response of the Afrikaners to this cry for justice, I shall never forget. It took me aback. The Afrikaners said, but justice is not the issue. Benevolence is the issue. There are 10 or 11, who counts, different nationalities in South Africa. We would like to see each of these nations, each of these nationalities develop its own culture, separate development, its own style of basket weaving, of cuisine, of clothing, of singing, and so forth. If that's to happen, they have to be pulled apart from each other, right? They can't just be, hence apartheid. What I saw before my eyes was benevolence, self-perceived benevolence, being used as an instrument of oppression. And I concluded on the spot that one of the fundamentally important things about justice is that it puts a brake, B-R-A-K-E, it puts a brake on self-perceived benevolence. It says, no matter how benevolent you may think you are, you cannot just shuffle people around as if they were animals. You have to honor their dignity. My awakening. The second was 2.5 years later, May 78, on the west side of Chicago, Conference on Palestinian Rights. And as I say in the book, I don't know why I was invited, and I never knew what it was in me that led me to go, but I did. There were about 150 Palestinians there. Most of them self-identified as Christian. Naively, I had the image of Palestinians as almost all Muslims. Mustaches, daggers in their teeth. These were Christians. And once again, they issued a searing call for justice. And once again, I heard God calling me to speak up for them and for justice. So that's how justice got on my agenda, if you want to put it like that. I didn't go seeking it. It came to me. To use the word that Steve quotes, it befell me. I suppose, well, I know that a lot of philosophers in that situation would have said, well, it's very interesting and so forth, but I've got other things on my agenda. I really felt this is a call from God. I cannot just say I've got other things on my agenda. So both of those were searing, awakening experiences. The Palestinians I shall never forget, with burning hot rhetoric, talking about what was happening to them. So I became the organization that sponsored it. Was called the Palestine Human Rights Campaign. I became chair of the board of that. South Africa went back to South Africa, I suppose maybe 4 times in various capacities. Once to be a character witness for Alan Boesak, to get him out of jail. Apartheid is gone. I think about 10 years ago, the possibility of a 2-state solution in the Middle East disappeared, and that it is now gone forever. So that's a matter of deep regret on my part, a failed cause. I don't regret being involved in the cause, but it's a failed cause.
Let me ask you just quickly, you probably saw a lot of books that he had about love, justice, peace and justice. Can you say how your experiences in South Africa, Israel, Palestine, came to inform your understanding of shalom and righteousness and love and justice? I know they're all big questions, but maybe you can wrap them all together.
Yeah. So most of my philosophical colleagues let me start differently. The American political philosopher who has been most influential over the past 50 years is the now deceased John Rawls at Harvard. Rawls wrote what became an extremely famous book on justice. Rawls states explicitly that what he's talking about is principles for fair distribution of benefits and burdens in an ideal society. There have been dozens of commentaries on Rawls, dozens and dozens of commentaries on Rawls. It's been a proliferating industry. Pretty boring. So I got at it from the opposite side, from two extremely non-ideal societies, apartheid South Africa and Palestine, Israel. And that has, so my reflections on justice have started from the wronged. That's been how to understand their situation. What is it about their situation that means that they are being wronged, and just that, as opposed to just not very nice and so forth. And I admit that when I got back from South Africa in September '76 and began reading the Old Testament again, the word justice leaped out in ways it never had before. I knew it was there, of course, but it hadn't jumped out. Now it just jumped out with red letters. Justice is all over the Old Testament. It's in the New Testament too, though it's a little bit concealed by how the translators translate the Greek. And then flying back from South Africa was a very depressing experience. In one way, it was exhilarating because of what I'd experienced. But to put justice on my agenda, and I was thinking about liturgy and I was thinking about art, and I had this overwhelming feeling my life is falling into fragments. It's just, I'm becoming a jack of all trades. What holds it together? Anything? And then I don't know how it happened, but one day, again, reading the Old Testament, I read the word peace. And I have the feeling that peace is a bad translation for the Hebrew. So I go to the Hebrew and I discover it's the word shalom. And peace is a very poor translation for the Hebrew shalom. I think the closest we can come in contemporary English is flourishing. Prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah 27, as I recall, says, "Seek the shalom of the city, for in its shalom is your shalom." Most translations say, "Seek the peace of the city, for in its peace is your peace." And of course, shalom is absence of peace. But it's so much more than that. It's flourishing in all dimensions of one's existence. So I become a crusader for, let's get rid of this sappy peace translation of shalom and understand it as what God wants for God's children is flourishing in all dimensions. And a indispensable component of flourishing, shalom, is justice. I think art is also indispensable for shalom. So I suddenly felt that I had a religious category to hold my life together. I think philosophy can contribute to shalom, to human flourishing. So all of these are dimensions of flourishing: art, justice, philosophy, properly taught.
So your shalom was interrupted. You write this. On Sunday afternoon, June 12, 1983, I received a phone call that shattered my comfortable life and divided it into before and after. The call was from our son Eric's landlady in Munich, Germany, where Eric was doing research for his doctoral dissertation, Architectural History. And then this is the call. "Mr. Wolterstorff," the landlady asked. "Yes." "Is this Eric's father?" "Yes." "Mr. Wolterstorff, I must give you some bad news." "Yes." "Eric has been climbing and has had an accident." "Yes." "Eric has had a serious accident." "Yes." "Mr. Wolterstorff, I must tell you, Eric is dead." "Mr. Wolterstorff, are you there?" You must come at once, Mr. Wolterstorff. Eric is dead. So you talk about what was before and what was after. And if you haven't read the book Lament for a Son, and you only read one book by Nick, then I recommend that book if you haven't read it yet. How did that affect how you think about God, life, humanity? And maybe you can talk about this at the end. What came long after? This was a while ago. What came long after? What are the lingering effects of the loss of your son?
I don't entirely know, but so yes, that call, the news slowly dribbled out by Eric's landlady, divided my life into before and after. A before in which I suppose you might say it was a charmed life. The people that I knew died were elderly. We had a thriving, lovely family. My teaching was going well and all of that. And now suddenly this rupture. I can only describe it as a rupture. When a person close to you dies, they're gone, of course. They've died. But there's also a big chunk of you that has been ripped out and is gone. You have felt affection for this person. Their hopes were intertwined with your hopes, their regrets with your regrets, their plans with your plans, on and on. And now, that's all gone. There's just a big hole that you have to learn to live around. It's always there. You never forget it. But you no longer make next summer's plans with Eric in view and so forth. So it was for me a shattering experience, as it is for anybody. And it shatters the sense of the ordinariness of things. Let me give you an actual example. It's crazy in a way, but I'm sure some of you have experienced the same thing. A few days after I get back to Grand Rapids, I'm in the D&W store in Gaslight Village. I can see it yet. A woman is putting a watermelon into her shopping basket. I could locate the very spot in the store where she was standing. And I felt like screaming. How can you act as if everything is the same when nothing is the same, when everything is profoundly... How can you act as if... How can you just go about these ordinary things in your ordinary ways? How can you possibly do that? So it's the shattering of the ordinariness. And one's got to learn to live a new, less ordinary life.
So this shatters lives, but it also can shatter faith.
It can also shatter faith. It didn't do that in my case, for which I'm enormously thankful, and I don't understand exactly why. It changed. So let me say two things about that. I have philosophical colleagues for whom the death of someone loved spurs them to try to figure out answers to why bad things happen to good people, how to understand God. I have found myself, I cannot read those things. The attempt to figure out why, I just can't do it. I live with the mystery. And that's good enough. I can live with unanswered questions, even big unanswered questions. So it wasn't that my faith in God was destroyed, but it altered. In what way did it alter? In what way did it change? Well, in retrospect, I see that I had a sort of domesticated God. Could comfortably say a variety of things about God and so forth. Now God seems to me both more awesome and more mysterious. More mysterious. So as I say, my God, in retrospect, was sort of domesticated. I figured I assumed that I had it sort of figured out. Now I don't understand in many ways, what God is up to. When I look at this creation in its immensity and its intricacy, I find it impossible not to believe that there's a God I prefer not to say who made it, who's performing it, who's actually making it happen. It's not that I disbelieve evolution, but I think evolution, behind the evolutionary process, is a God of incredible is too weak a word, incredible intelligence and power. And when I reflect on the biblical testimony about the resurrection of Jesus, I find it totally compelling. So my faith has remained, but God got out of the cage.
All right. So I think I'll just ask one last question. It's your life, Nick, and it's your book. So I warned him I would do this. Why don't you pick a favorite passage and read it to us, and then tell us why you picked that one.
Well, I kind of like most of the book, you know.
We have time. Maybe we should take a quick bathroom break, though.
I haven't asked her whether it's okay with her, but I'm going to read first a little passage, a part of what I say about Claire, and then I'll pick another passage. I first met Claire Kingsley in the Chimes office at Calvin College, shortly after the beginning of my junior year and her freshman year. She got my attention immediately. She was beautiful and had flair, a flair in her bearing, a flair in how she dressed, but not a flamboyant flair, a restrained flair, if that makes sense. She did not look around to see how other women dressed and then dress that way. She decided for herself how she would dress. Of course, someone might decide for herself how she would dress, and the result might be appalling. Not so with Claire. Nothing eccentric, a scarf worn in an unexpected way, an unusual fabric, an unusual style of jacket, flair but never flash. I learned later that she sold most of her clothes herself. She still does. And to this day, people come up to her and tell her how much they admire something she's wearing, always something she made. Later, I came to see that her way of dressing was just one mark of her talent for putting a stamp on things in her surrounding. She has an eye for the distinctive and the beautiful. I go on. But now I'm going to give you the second to last. The book consists of vignettes. What word did Steve use? Kelly pressured me? Pestered. I think the right word is nagged. Kelly and a few other friends nagged me to write this book. And I resisted. One reason for resistance was, hey, look, as you know, I grew up in this tiny farm village in Minnesota of Dutch Reformed Protestant immigrants and Minnesota culture. And these two cultures, Minnesota culture and Dutch immigrant culture, conspired to say together, never talk about yourself. Never toot your own horn. If somebody compliments you, say thank you. Not bad, I suppose. But never anything. It's not a soil in which autobiography grows. But eventually, after Kelly's nagging and that of other people, I said, okay, But then I didn't know how to do it. Because I've never kept a journal, never kept a diary. My memory is no better than average, maybe worse than average. So I couldn't tell the story of my life. So what was I going to do? So finally it occurred to me, I won't even try to tell the story of my life. I'll have a succession of, I'll call them vignettes, set pieces, things that happened to me, formative things, funny things, appalling things, whatever. So that's what it is, a series of vignettes. Now I want to read to you the second to the last, because it's one that's most fresh in my mind. These vignettes are roughly in the order in which they occurred. The most moving teaching experience, I wrote teaching experience, but I should have written the most moving teaching learning experience of my entire life occurred during the spring of 2016. The main campus of Calvin College and Calvin Seminary is the Knollcrest campus, located in southeastern Grand Rapids. A few years ago, the college and seminary together established a second campus, this one in Hanlon State Prison for Men, located outside Ionia, Michigan, about 25 miles east of Grand Rapids. The Hanlon campus, like the Knollcrest campus, offers an accredited baccalaureate degree. Prisoners from around the state can apply for admission to the program, and 20 new students are accepted per year. The courses are taught by professors from the college and seminary, and they are for the most part the same as courses taught on the Knollcrest campus. Kevin Corcoran, a member of the philosophy department at Calvin, was teaching his Introduction to Philosophy course in Hanlon Prison during the spring of 2016. For some years, he had included my book, Lament for a Son, in the syllabus for his course, and he did in the prison. As they were discussing lament in the prison class, Kevin happened to mention to the prisoners, the class, that he knew me and that I lived in Grand Rapids. The men in the class brought up the idea of inviting me to visit their class. So Kevin invited me, and I accepted. The director of the Calvin program, Todd Chaffee, drove me to the prison, explaining the program as we drove, and remarking that to avoid church-state problems, Calvin had paid for decorating and furnishing the room the prison assigned them. After much paper shuffling at the front desk, I was admitted into the prison, and Todd led me to the classroom. I was immediately struck by how ample it was and how beautifully furnished. Far more beautifully furnished than any classroom I had known on the Knollcrest campus. There was a lot of wood trim and wooden desks and chairs that had been made and beautifully finished in the prison workshop. Off to one side was an alcove for the library, and it too was beautifully furnished. The entire ensemble spoke of dignity. Here, in this room at least, these men were not being warehoused. What happened next brought tears to my eyes. The 20 men in the class, later I learned that 17 of them were in prison for life, all had copies of the lament, and they lined up for me to sign their copies. As I was signing their copies, they would say, "We are so honored, Professor, that you have come to visit our class." Never before had students told me that they were honored by my presence in their classroom. Sometimes when I am introduced as speaker, the person introduces me declares sort of pro forma that the group is honored to have me as its speaker that evening. I take that to mean something like, it's a feather in our cap that Professor W accepted our invitation to speak. These prisoners were not saying it was a feather in their cap that I'd shown up. They, who were daily demeaned, forced to knuckle under, and ordered around, were saying that my presence honored them, declared that they were not worthless scum, declared that they possessed honor. At any rate, that's what I understood them to be saying. I do not tear up when someone introducing me declares that the group is honored by my acceptance of their invitation to speak. I did tear up when these men declared that they were honored that I'd come to visit their class. After Kevin introduced me, I said a few words about how I came to write the book, and then opened it up for discussion. I have never before discussed lament in a class. I imagine that when the book is discussed in a regular college or seminary course, the teacher poses to the class questions like, what is Wolterstorff's understanding of grief? Does that understanding seem correct to you? What is the author's theology in the book? Do you agree with that theology? I would find it impossible to participate in such discussions. That is not how the discussion went in Hanlon Prison. The men in the class were themselves in grief. Most of them not over the death of a child, but over the ruin they had wreaked on their own lives and the lives of others. I came to realize what had never occurred to me before. Seems obvious, that a prison is a house of grief. I was puzzled for the first 10 minutes about what was going on. I couldn't figure out why they were saying what they were saying. And then I fell to it. They were reading the book not so much as my expression of my grief, but as an expression of their grief. Similar to the way in which we use the words of the Psalms to pray our own prayers. They would turn to a passage, read it aloud, and explain how the words spoke for them. They were amazingly open, more open than students in any other college class I've ever taught. Some described the crime they had committed. Several spoke of how they had destroyed their relationships with the people they loved. Their comments were articulate, emotionally intense, suffused by life experience, eloquent. They offered interpretations of my words that had never occurred to me. I was the student that day. They were the teachers. I felt profoundly my common humanity with these men. Yes, I was a professor who had never spent a day of his life behind bars, and they were prisoners, mostly lifers. But we were in this together, reading the text, discussing the text, sharing our grief. I felt more connected with these lifers than I've ever felt connected with 18 to 22-year-old college students. And at some point, the feeling washed over me. What a terrible waste of life. Yes, these men have committed serious crimes and deserve to be punished. But isn't there some alternative way to locking them up for life? Must human lives be wasted in this way? When the class session was over, they lined up to shake my hand. And again they said how honored they were that I had come to visit their class. As the last few filed past, I said what I had felt but had not, until then, been able to put into words. You have honored me by allowing my words to express your grief.
What time is it, Mike? What time is it? I just want to see the time.
Huh?
What time is it?
Oh, 8:30.
We're going to have a few minutes for questions, so if you want to come up, these mics are or will be on if you want to come up and ask a question.
Hi, Dr. Wolterstorff. Thank you so much for sharing, taking us through your memoir. I've been profoundly impacted by a lot of the work you've done, and one of the things I would like to ask you tonight is something that is on my heart and in the heart of a lot of church leaders and people who participate in building some measure of the kingdom of God, or at least trying to embody its principles. In Until Justice and Peace Embrace, you talk about the Reformed worldview as not avertive or otherworldly, but more transformative in its potential. And something that you just mentioned tonight about being shaped by apartheid, being shaped by so many of these experiences, by justice, by all of these things standing out to us for the first time, reading scripture. How would you suggest that church leaders and people in faith communities can spur discipleship on into a direction that allows for justice to be, in the words of your experience with the prisoners in Handlin, allowing us as the church to express the grief of a broken creation, and not just in rhetoric, but in the praxis of our faith communities?
Yeah, so my answer to that question generalizes from my own experience. I think in my own experience, it was being confronted in South Africa by the victims of apartheid injustice, being confronted on the west side of Chicago with these Palestinians, being confronted with, and then in Hanlon prison. In my experience, it's seeing the faces and hearing the voices. I think the church has to, what Brian Stevenson in his book Just Mercy calls proximity. If we keep injustice at a distance or just treat it journalistically, nothing is going to happen. So I think it's indispensable that one sees the faces, hears the voices, the actual voices. Now they can be on film, novels, but I think information is not enough. I think what happens when you see the faces and hear the voices, that a blend of empathy and anger gets evoked. I think emotional engagement is indispensable.
Can I add something there, Nick? Because
Yeah.
we're the Kaufman Interfaith Institute, and we're hosting this tonight. And what we do is try to fight against anti-religious bigotry. I'd say mostly against Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And we have lots of things going on that do what you suggest, where we're trying to bring Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and other religions. We're trying to bring people together, because reading is good,
Yeah.
but until you look into somebody's eyes and you listen, lives don't really change. And so, I hope some new folks are here to this Kaufman event, and I hope that you'll want to do justice by being part of some of the activities that we have going on. And you can find information over there about some of the activities we have. There are fewer activities in the summer, but if you registered, we have your email address. So you haven't heard the last from us, and we'll have a lot more opportunities for you in the fall. James, this will be the last question.
I have, in the course of my working life, believed and been motivated somewhat by the conviction that truth can be expressed in words, that words joined together into sentences can persuade, can change minds, can change the world. I have to think that that must be something that you've thought in order to do the things that you've done. But I want to ask you, do you still believe it now?
Do I still believe that now?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. As I've just indicated, when it comes to justice and no doubt other matters, I think it has to be a blend of words and emotional engagement. But the words are important. So yes, all this talking and writing that I've done in the expectation that it will do some bit of good. And also because I enjoy it often. I enjoyed writing a good deal of In This World of Wonders. Other passages were a struggle, I do admit, but then it's gratifying when the struggle turns out very well. To describe my experience in Hanlon Prison, to try to capture it, to capture what I felt, was when I finally had it down on paper, it was gratifying. So I thought, yeah.
On that note, I think we'll stop. There are books over there that you can purchase, not just In This World of Wonders, but other books. Nick will be available over there to sign copies of the book as well. I want to thank all of you for coming, and please join me in thanking Nicholas Wolterstorff.
And I want to thank the Kaufman Institute for the honor you have paid me by hosting this evening session. Thanks, Doug.
Hey, it's a feather in our cap.